Okay, calm down.
Thank you so much for joining the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
Of course. I wanted to ask you about how, as a historian, obviously, how you see history informing the present moment, right? So we just had America watching the Super Bowl while Israel bombs Rafah. You are someone who obviously explains the colonial nature of the founding of Israel, something which, as you point out, you don't have to be a historian to acknowledge. You can just listen to the actual people like Jabotinsky or look at the Colonial Trust or various institutions that have colonial in its name, the Jewish Colonization Association. So it's colonial. It was a colonial, settler colonial project. Who got what out of that? And how does that shape the present moment?
I think all you have to do is look at what's happening in the West Bank or occupied Arab East Jerusalem, where under cover of the war, a whole bunch of thousands of new residential units are going to be established, Israeli only, Jewish only, on land that's either being confiscated or has questionable status. That's a colonial settler project that's ongoing in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. Indeed, there are responsible ministers in the Israeli government who are talking about recommencing the settlement of the Gaza Strip on Arab land again. So I don't think you even have to look back at the Jewish Colonization Agency, which was wound up in 1958, or the self-described settler colonial nature of the early Zionist project, to see that land acquisition and changing the demography balance in favor of a Jewish majority from what was originally up until 1948 an Arab majority, which are the landmarks of a settler colonial regime, have always been there. They are there now, and they have always been there, and that was understood certainly before World War II by all concerned. So it's the nature of that whole project is and has always been. As Jabotinsky, you mentioned Jabotinsky. Jabotinsky said, what we're trying to do is transform Palestine into the land of Israel, and that means land, and that means people, and that was always what it was about.
What were the advantages for the British and then for the United States as they kind of enabled this colonialism?
Right. Well, the British had a whole set of strategic objectives. Palestine lies to the east of Egypt. Egypt had the Suez Canal. It was vital to the empire. It was the connection to the East Asian Empire, to its Indian Empire, to its East African Empire. So Egypt was vital. And early in the 20th century, the British decided they had to control Palestine because it protected the eastern flank of Egypt. That's a decision that they took in 1905, 1906. And that had nothing to do with Zionism. That's the primary motive for Britain's desire to control Palestine. They then began to think about the importance of controlling the shortest land route between the Mediterranean and the Gulf. And Palestine is the Mediterranean terminus of that land route. And later on, the British built a whole series of air bases and then roads and then a pipeline along that land route. So Palestine was important strategically to the empire, and that's why they wanted it. They came upon several additional reasons for supporting Zionism. One of them was, in the words of a British colonial official, Sir Ronald Storrs, to create a little Jewish Ulster in a sea of hostile Arabs. And if you think of the British in Ireland, and you think of, from Cromwell onwards, and the replacement and the what they call the plantation of loyal British subjects in hostile Catholic Ireland. That's what in at least Storrs' mind, Britain was up to. And I can't imagine that wasn't in the minds of people like Lord Balfour, Winston Churchill, and Lloyd George, all of whom were engaged in fighting the Irish at the very same time that they were issuing the Balfour Declaration and producing the mandate for Palestine. So it's essentially strategic, in my view, strategic interests. There are others. There's what you'd call today Christian Zionism, a sort of evangelical connection to the idea that it's a Christian obligation that the Jews be returned to their ancestral homeland, for reasons that have nothing to do with the Jews. It has to do with the coming of the Messiah and so on and so forth.
In fact, a lot of us will have to die or convert.
Yeah, you all would disappear. We all would disappear, and only those who were saved, whatever. Those ideas are developing in the early 19th century. Lord Shaftesbury and a bunch of other very influential people, and evangelical elements in the Anglican Church were really into that. And it's persistent. We have it today in American politics, in the American evangelical fealty to Israel, for these eschatological crazy reasons. I mean, I would see them as crazy, but anyway. So that's another motivation. Yet another motivation is, I would argue, anti-Semitism. In other words, the same individual who issued the Balfour Declaration in his capacity as Foreign Secretary in 1917 is the prime minister who's responsible for the Alien Exclusion Acts, which kept persecuted Jews fleeing the pogroms of the Russian Empire from entering Britain in 1905, 1906. It's passed in 1905, becomes a law in 1906. And that's the same guy, Balfour. He's prime minister in 1905 and 1906. He's foreign secretary by 1917. So there's a mix of motivations. Some people, overemphasize, in my view, the Christian Zionism or anti-Semitism or other wartime objectives. If we do this, all the Jews in the world will support the Allied war effort. I don't think those were important. They were there. There were certainly motivations. The major reason for Britain doing what it does is always strategic and in the interest of the empire. And that's why they wanted Palestine. And for them, Zionism was a convenient way to do that.
And for the United States?
Well, with the United States, it starts off, I would argue, with evangelical Christian Zionism. That's what drives, I think, Woodrow Wilson. Also a colonial worldview. He was an old-fashioned white supremacist Southern racist. He looked down on the inferior peoples of the globe, as did the British of that era, most of them. Certainly the British ruling class, Balfour, Churchill and Balfour are notorious for some of the kinds of statements they made. And we know about Woodrow Wilson today. So that was what it was initially. There was no particular strategic interest involved. It's only much later, when the United States becomes a Middle Eastern power after World War II, that the United States begins to think of Israel after it's established, or the establishment of Israel in 1947-48, as a strategic interest. That's much later, though. But American support is not that important. Wilson is supportive at the peace conference in 1919 on Zionism. But, the most important thing is the British position.
Right. And then, of course, the American support becomes central.
Absolutely. I mean, without American support, you would not have had a partition resolution. The Soviets are also involved, but the Americans brought many more votes to that General Assembly majority than did the Soviets. The Soviets brought 4 or 5 votes. The Americans brought dozens.
And so at that point, what is America hoping to get out of its support of Israel?
Well, I would argue you have a couple of the same kind of motivations that you find at the time of the Balfour Declaration in Britain. Philo-Semitism and support for Zionism out of Christian, a sort of sense of a Christian obligation to return the Jewish people to their ancestral homeland. Anti-Semitism that kept American immigration law anti-Semitic and anti-Arab and anti-Catholic and so on from the 1920s right up until the 1960s. In other words, we don't want them here. When populations in Europe that were suffering persecution Jewish populations in Europe that were suffering persecution and that could still have been saved, were trying to find a place of refuge. They couldn't come to the United States, or Britain for that matter, because of racist, anti-Semitic British and American immigration laws. So there was a sense of guilt for what happened during the Holocaust. The United States might not have been able to prevent it, but before World War II, the United States could certainly have saved many people, and did not. Roosevelt wouldn't, Truman wouldn't change American immigration law. And then I think you have, finally, a sense of guilt about the Holocaust generally, and a sense that the Jewish people deserve something from Christian Europe and from the United States, which had failed to do more to prevent it. That this was done at the expense of the Arabs was a tertiary consideration, if it was a consideration at all.
Right. Going back to the history, you, of course, have a very fascinating connection to this story. Can you talk about your great uncle, Yusuf Zia al-Khalidi?
Sure. Yusuf Zia was a very unusual character for his time. He had a traditional Muslim religious education. His father was a senior official in the Sharia court in Jerusalem, and his grandfather had held that position. So he came from a long line of judges and religious officials that had a classical Islamic training. And he went and got a Western education in Malta, and then in Istanbul, and in other places, and finally in Austria, in Vienna, where he studied at the Royal Imperial University. And he served in a variety of positions, diplomatic and governmental, in the Ottoman government. But then he was elected to the first Ottoman parliament in 1877 as a deputy for Jerusalem. So he had served as a deputy for Jerusalem in the Ottoman parliament. And he later on became mayor of Jerusalem in the I believe in the 1880s, late 1870s, 1880s. And he was very well acquainted. At different times when he fell into disfavor with the Ottoman regime, he went to Austria, Austro-Hungary, Habsburg Empire, and taught at the university where he had studied, the Royal Imperial University. So he knew a great deal about European anti-Semitism. He'd studied Judaism. We have his books in the family library, so we know what he read. And we have his correspondence. We know from his writings to European Orientalists and to others a lot about his mindset and what he knew. And he knew about Zionism. We have copies of Austrian papers that he was receiving. So he writes to Theodor Herzl in 1899, 2 years after the first Zionist Congress takes place in Basel, in Switzerland. And he says to him, first of all, that we and Muslims and Jews are cousins. We're both children of Abraham, and we very much, and we understand the connection between Judaism and the Jewish people and Palestine. And he said, I understand the degree to which your people are being persecuted in Europe. He'd lived in a capital in Vienna, whose mayor, a guy called Karl Neuger, was a fanatical anti-Semite. There's, by the way, still a statue of this character around the Ringstrasse in Vienna. He
was one of Hitler's heroes, right?
I believe he was. Yeah, Neuger is a horrific figure. Yeah. There's still a statue of him in Vienna.
See, I know they're Austrian, but Germans and Austrians focus on that, clean that up instead of trying to make Palestinians pay for your crimes. Just a suggestion.
Exactly. Yeah, just a suggestion. I mean, take the statue down or hang something around his neck. Yeah. Dedicated anti-Semite. That's right. Funny. Anyway, so he knew about anti-Semitism, and he says this in his letter to Herzl. And he says, I understand that he'd probably read accounts of the Zionist Congress in German, uncensored. He may have read other writings, probably had read other writings of Herzl's. We don't know exactly but he knew a lot about it. It seems like he knew a lot about Zionism. And he said, the idea of Zionism in principle is fine. You're a people, you want to see yourself as a modern nationalist. No problem in principle. He says, the problem is here. If you do it here, there's a people who's already here. You're going to have problems in terms of what dual loyalties for Jews all over the Ottoman Empire. You're going to have problems with the Ottoman Empire, but you're going to have problems with us, with the people, the Paka nation, that won't be superseded. And he ends that part of the letter by saying, for the sake of God, leave Palestine alone. So that's Yusuf Zia al-Khalidi. He's an interesting figure, one of the earliest Palestinians to foresee the problem that was to come.
Did immigration laws change after the Holocaust in the United States and Europe?
No, not in the United States until I think Lyndon Johnson passed a much more liberal immigration law, I think 1964.
So you'd think that would also be a way that people could have dealt with some of the guilt?
You would think. But better to shove it off somewhere else. I mean, I think that the same kind of philo-Semitism / anti-Semitism that you had in Britain with Balfour himself may have operated in the case of the United States. I'm a non-American historian. I've studied Britain extensively. My first book was about British policy, and you had to learn about the mindset of that aristocracy that ran Britain in those days. So I think both things were there definitely with the British. I would guess they were there with American elites. I mean, we know that anti-Semitism was deep-seated in this country. We know that the Ku Klux Klan hanged Jews and Arabs along with the mainly Black people. We know that American universities were discriminatory and had a tiny quota for Jews. My university, Harvard, all of them, certainly all of the Ivy League schools. So that's there for sure as a motivation for keeping There's also Protestant bias, keeping Catholics out. I mean, this was meant, the immigration laws of the early 20s were not just meant to keep Jews or Arabs out, or Chinese or Asians. They were meant to keep Southern European Catholics out, and only allow Nordic Protestants, white, blonde Nordic Protestants, into the United States. That was the motivation behind the laws of the immigration laws of the mid 1920s.
And can you talk about, speaking of the kind of marriage between anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism, can you talk about the relationship or the occasional collaboration between the Nazis and the Zionists?
Yeah. Well, it was a transactional arrangement. I mean, in the case of a very limited number of extremists who were sort of neo-fascist people in the Stern Gang, to some extent the Yearbook, and who were attracted by fascist ideas. It was transactional in the main, in that there was a desire to increase the Jewish population of Palestine during the Mandate, and there was a German desire to get rid of Jews. Remember, the actual Holocaust, the actual murder of all these people, is only planned and executed during World War II. We're talking about the 30s, before the war starts. When, as far as the Germans are concerned, getting rid of their Jewish problem means getting the Jews out of Germany. And anybody who would have taken them, they would have gladly sent them there. And the Jewish Agency, via something called the Transfer Agreement, arranged for German Jews to not just be allowed to leave and come to Palestine, but to take some of their assets with them. So you got, on the one hand, from the Nazi perspective, Jews out of Germany, and from the perspective of the Jewish Agency, which is the mainstream, Ben Gurion-led, Chaim Weizmann-led body that the British had created and recognized as the sort of quasi-state of the Zionist movement in Palestine. From the point of view of the Jewish Agency, you were getting not just highly qualified, highly educated, talented, skilled immigrants, you were getting capital. So the capital inflows in the 1930s are amazing to Palestine, partly as a result. And the population shift is dramatic. The Jewish population as a proportion of the whole is 17 or 18% in 1929, 30, 31, 32. And then starting with the rise of Hitler, it just shoots up. In 1935, you have 60,000 Jewish immigrants, actually more than 60,000. The official figure is 60, there's probably 62, 3, 4, 5. That's as much as the entire Jewish population of Palestine in 1917. And so the proportion, the Jewish proportion of the total population rises from 17 or 18% to 31%. By the time World War II breaks out, by 1939. And this is a dramatic shift. Ben Gurion writes in his diaries, at this rate, we'll have a Jewish majority and we'll have a Jewish state. We don't have to do anything. We don't have to lift a finger. So, I mean, this is really very, very important for understanding Palestinian history, not just understanding the history of the Yishuv and of Zionism in Israel.
Right. What is your relationship like with Palestine today in terms of visiting or friends and family and colleagues there? What is your sense of what people are experiencing there right now?
I mean, I haven't been there since, March of last year. I haven't been there for 10 months. I have family there. I have lots of friends there. I work with people, mainly based in Ramallah and in Jerusalem, and in Haifa, actually, also. I gave a talk up in Haifa in March, I think last March. What's my sense of the situation there?
Or your sense of how people are experiencing it? What are they reporting to you, to the extent that you can be in contact? I mean, I'm assuming in Gaza, if you have contacts there, it's hard to be in touch with them. But
it's very hard to be in touch with them. My niece, who lives in Ramallah, is married to someone from Gaza. All of whose family are there, and who've moved around 5 or 6 times. It's very hard to get in touch with them. She sends us reports when they can, charge their phones, when there's internet, when, they can contact the outside world, which is sometimes only once a week or even less frequently. The situation is appalling. They're all sick. There's no medicine. They spend all of their time cold, trying to find fuel, trying to find water, trying to find food. Several of them are musicians, so they're playing for refugee children in one of the camps in Mawasi. The families in different places, in the central and southern parts of Gaza. Some are in Rafah, some are in Mawasi. They're in different places. We're talking about an extended family of 6 or 8 people. I think they're in a couple of places right now. It's awful. The situation is unspeakable. These are, middle-class people with a comfortable house in Gaza City, they had to leave it multiple times. They moved around, and now they're probably or maybe having to move yet again. So I hear from them via my niece. And I hear from my brother, my niece, my nephew, my various family members about the situation in Jerusalem and the West Bank, which is pretty dire as well. Not anything like the horrors of Gaza, but pretty dire.
And I know that I ran into you and you had told me something about sending your books.
Yeah. I had been sending books for many, many months, a couple hundred maybe, to something that was established by a poet called Musab Abu Taha. Some of your listeners may have heard of, and who just managed to get out of Gaza. And he established the Edward Said Library in Gaza. And I think by the time the war started, he had established a couple of branches of it. And I had sent a couple of hundred books, as did, by the way, several of my colleagues here at Columbia who knew him, to this library. The library has now been, as far as I know, destroyed, along with pretty much every other library in the Gaza Strip, along with every other university in the Gaza Strip, along with dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of university personnel, 2 university presidents, a half dozen university deans, dozens of faculty and staff, and God knows how many students. As well, unfortunately, as the librarian, the woman who was in charge of it. She was killed in an airstrike that killed her and all of her family. So that's the story of the Edward Said Library. I don't know what of it remains. I don't know how badly damaged it was. He doesn't answer me. He won't give me details. We know that Dua, the woman who was in charge, was killed. We've seen her name in the list of people killed and the other members of her family. I don't know exactly what happened to the library. My understanding is that it's either destroyed or damaged. But that's only books. Dara will never come back, but the books, who cares? It's just books.
What does it feel like? I mean, I don't know if you can even put it into words, but you're this incredibly respected, established historian at Columbia. And yet the people from whom you come are treated as disposable by the Israelis, but also by the enabling of your own government. What is it? Is there a disconnect between the way you're treated as an academic and the way you're seen as a Palestinian whose life doesn't matter in some ways? Like if you were there in Palestine now instead of here, right, you would just be collateral damage. What is that?
If I were in Gaza, yes.
Yeah.
If I were in Gaza, that would be the case. And even in the West Bank, life is more precarious than elsewhere. What does it feel like? It's very alienating, especially on the part of our own government. I mean, in Israel, you have a settler colonial process that's been marching on for generations, for more than a century. That it's what we know. Palestinian life is not valued. The tragic thing is that Palestinian life is not valued in this country or by our media or by our government. When I say in this country, not by everybody, but by certainly our elites, by the New York Times. I could go on and on about the media, the mainstream corporate legacy media, even by our university administration. We have here the only Center for Palestine Studies in the United States. We have here 2 dozen faculty who are experts in what they do. Some of them experts on Zionism, some of them experts on anti-Semitism, some of them experts on Palestine. None of whom were ever consulted by the university when it takes measures, such as a letter from some dean saying that these specific sets of words, intifada, by all means necessary, harmful and hurtful and anti-Semitic and so on and so forth, without anybody asking anybody who knows about anti-Semitism. They created a task force made up of 3 of the most, headed, I should say, by 3 of the most committed partisans for Israel in the entire faculty, which is supposed to deal with anti-Semitism. Most of these members don't know anything about anti-Semitism. And we actually have a lot of people, faculty members, whose specialty is, among other things, anti-Semitism. A couple of them were included, but most of the people there are chosen for obviously other reasons. So it feels alienating. I don't feel that from my own colleagues. I certainly don't feel that from students. I don't feel that from my readers, people who write me about my books. But certainly from our government, from the media, it's horrific to know what the reality is, and to know the lying disinformation that passes for reality on television, for example, on NPR, in the Times and the Post, and so or from our university administration, and most of them are no different, or Congress. I could go on. It's extremely alienating, obviously.
What are some of the myths, lies, inaccuracies that are most frustrating for you to hear from the media or your administration or Congress?
Well, I mean, let's just take a term like intifada. Intifada means rising up, shaking off. In Palestinian political parlance, it's used to describe the two major uprisings against an illegal Israeli military occupation, which in 1987 had been going on for 20 years, and which in 2000, during the second Intifada started, had been going on for 33 years, and which has now been going on for 56 years. And if anything is legitimate, it's an uprising against an illegal military occupation, condemned by international law, the United Nations, and so on and so forth. But this has turned into a call for genocide in the twisted minds of the people who tell us what we can say and can't say on campus, or the partisan hacks in Congress who have decreed that there was a call for genocide at Harvard and widened the president of Harvard. Nobody called for genocide at Harvard. That's not what that word means. It doesn't mean genocide. It means uprising. Uprising against what? Uprising against the Jewish people? No. Uprising against an illegal military occupation, which has now gone on for 56 years. In June, it'll be 57 years. So that's a typical example of the way this thing has been twisted. And if you ask 200 odd Republican members of Congress, in lockstep, like lemmings, they will say, yes, intifada means genocide. And I bet a whole lot of Democrats would go along with it. So that's a typical example. I could give you many, many, many others.
And in terms of media narratives that you find particularly damaging or dangerous or untruthful?
Well, a number of them. I mean, I don't know where to start. One would be that the history started on the 7th of October, obviously. Did not. Something dramatic, something in many ways unprecedented, something horrific happened on the 7th of October, and things considerably more horrific have been happening ever since. Whatever happened on October 7th was horrific, horrible. It was a massacre of civilians, largest civilian death toll in Israeli history since 1948. So it deserved all of the attention it got. But 25 times as many Palestinians have been killed as Israelis were killed on the 7th of October or immediately afterwards. And that does not get the same attention. 25 times as many. 29,000 and 8,000 missing. 29,000 dead and 8,000 missing. Most of them are civilians. 12,000 of them are children. More than half the population of Gaza are children. So the 68,000 wounded and the 28,000 dead and the 8,000 missing include a large proportion of children, maybe half of them, maybe a third of them. And then a lot of women and old men and civilians of other sorts. None of this is treated with a kind of loving, individuated attention that is given, rightly, to Israeli victims. So, one is aghast at the racism, at the inherent disparity between the loving way in which Israeli children or Israeli women, civilians are treated in the media, and the callous way in which 25 times as many Palestinians, most of whom, again, as with the Israelis, most of whom are civilians, are not treated. They're just lumped. And then if they accurately give the number, which the New York Times systematically did not do for weeks and weeks and months, if they give the number, it's just a number. There's 29,000 cockroaches, 29,000 whatever. Whereas, as I've said, other losses are individuated. We've gotten this before. I mean, it's not unfamiliar to anyone who looks at the coverage of the Iraq War. American soldiers, their deaths are individuated. The multiple, many times greater number of Iraqi civilian deaths are never, we rarely talk about. The same was the same in Vietnam, obviously, and so forth. That's the way it is in colonial wars. And this is a colonial war.
How so?
When you listen to Israeli politicians saying we're going to resettle Gaza and we're going to occupy Gaza, what is that? What is that? It may be the land of Israel in their fantasies, in their imagination, but it's one people taking over the land of another people, which is what the whole business was about from Herzl to today. As Zev Jabotinsky said, the objective is to transform Palestine into the land of Israel, and that's what has been done systematically ever since.
Right. What are your feelings about? Well, I've heard you speak very passionately about Biden.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think of him? I've heard you say that you wouldn't vote for him. Why? What do you think motivates him?
What motivates Joseph Biden? Well, I mean, I don't know. I don't know the man. I know what I read, and I know. I mean, I'm a trained historian. I read texts, so I can watch the body language and I can read the statements. That's the best I can do. And from that evidence, I would say several things. The first is that this is a man who still lives in the 60s. As far as he's concerned, this idealized vision of Israel is Israel to this day. The second thing I could say is he's someone who has clearly been brainwashed by the Israeli politicians and the lobbyists who have focused on him for his entire life. Starting with Golda Meir. I mean, I heard her speak once. I've seen many tapes. I heard her speak when I was an undergraduate once upon a time. Same room. I've seen her on television. She was charismatic, strange though it may be to see it. She was attractive in a certain way. She wasn't good looking, but she had a charisma to her. She was extremely articulate, very smart. And
from Milwaukee, is that correct?
She grew up in Milwaukee. Yeah. That's correct. She was born in what is now Ukraine, right. But she grew up in Milwaukee. Her teenage years, I think she arrived when she was 8 or 10 or something like that. Her American English was perfect, flawless. She understood the United States. She'd grown up in the United States, and she emigrated to Palestine, I believe, in her 20s. He has described her impact on him. So we can go on what he said. I believe what he said. He was taken by Golda. And I think he was similarly taken by a number of other Israeli politicians who, many of them are particularly adept at speaking to Westerners. I mean, look, this is a project created by Europeans and Americans. There are many Eastern Mizrahi Jews who are Israelis. So you have people from all over the Arab world, Iran, Turkey, and so on. But the people who founded it, the people who read it, the signatories on the Declaration of Independence are Europeans and Americans. By origin, by birth, by education, by training, by politicization, by integration into those societies before they decided they couldn't live there anymore and they went to Palestine. So for them, for Herzl to speak to a German or an Austrian audience, for a Weizmann to speak to a British audience, for a Golda Meir to speak to an American audience, is to talk to an audience that's her or his audience. They're not talking to foreigners and they're not talking to a foreign culture. It's their culture. Even as they become Israelis, they're still in Netanyahu. I mean, he speaks with this perfect flat American accent. He grew up in Cornell and Philly. I mean, he lived in Israel before and after, but he's an American as far as his acculturation is concerned. So one can see how Biden will have been affected by that. And I think he has a casual contempt for the Palestinians. I mean, many of the things he's said are insulting and dehumanizing to the Palestinians. What he said about Palestinian casualties.
I have no notion that the Palestinians are telling the truth about how many people are killed. I'm sure innocents have been killed, and it's the price of waging a war. I think we should be incredibly careful. I think not we, the Israelis should be incredibly careful to be sure that they're focusing on going after the folks that are propagating this war against Israel. And it's against their interest when that doesn't happen. But I have no confidence in the number that the Palestinians are using.
So I think he's a man who decided that support of Israel was an important part of his political, persona early on, I think. And there are many statements by him. If Israel didn't exist, we'd have to create it. I'm a Zionist, and so on and so forth. This is not a casual part of his political orientation or his ideology. And I think he's surrounded himself with people like Blinken, with people like Sullivan, with the people, his chief of staff, all the people around him, a Praetorian Guard of people who think just like he does, who have a contempt for and an ignorance of the Arab world and of the Palestinians, who know and are concerned with Israeli desiderata, and who see the Middle East essentially through an Israeli lens. I mean, I sometimes would feel listening to him or to Admiral Kirby, his main spokesperson of the National Security Council,
who's
that
getting
these
an
guys
expanded role, apparently. That's breaking news.
Yeah, God help us.
I know.
God help us. I feel when I listen to him in particular, but the president and Sullivan and Blinken, that they're reading off an Israeli teleprompter. They're saying things that the Israeli government, exactly what the Israeli government says. Exactly what the Israeli government said. Now, they're beginning to diverge slightly from that script, probably for callous, cold political reasons, i.e. you're going to lose Michigan, i.e. the youth vote, i.e. the black churches, i.e. Not because they've suddenly seen Palestinians as human or they understand anything more than they did before.
And what do you say to the people who, I'm sure you've heard this many times, but Trump?
Well, we're talking in this case about, as far as Palestine and the Middle East is concerned,